Welcome back, everyone. I trust that you have had a fantastic day of learning with partners and colleagues today. I know I've been bouncing in and out of a number of sessions, and they've been just well done and great conversation. So I hope amidst that you've had some time to get some body breaks in and avoid the website fatigue that's grown quite substantially in our last little ways of working together. I was just attending some of our wellness sessions, and I know how important that is. So we're about to open our final keynote presentation of the day. And so my pleasure to be able to welcome Dr. Dianne Looker. I'm going to remind everyone, though, that the keynote will be live streamed. And again, you all have the opportunity to ask questions that I can moderate for you at the end of the session. So we have the same two opportunities that we've continued to have over the last day and a half. The first is to send your questions directly to Patricia Prouse at the CELU link, which is celu.info@usask.ca, or again, selu.info@usask.ca. I believe our technology folks will make sure that's on the screen for you today, so you can do that. The second method is how many of you have been shouting out today. Thank you. Sending your questions via Twitter to our graduate student support person, Udowu Mogaji. And that is at hashtag NCREC 2021. So hashtag National Conference on Rural Education in Canada 2021. So Patricia and Udowu will collate the questions and fire them off to me, and then I will ask them at the end of the session. So with that little brief introduction, I'd like to introduce Dr. Murray Scarf, Dean Emeritus from our College of Education and the founder of the National Rural Education Congress in Canada. So Murray has been championing rural education pretty much since the earth was cooling. And there's no one else I know whose knowledge, understanding, and commitment to rural ed runs as deeply as this man's. Our graduate student scholarship for the Congress was named in his honor, and we are deeply appreciative and humbled from his continued advice, support, and even service to our Congress. We keep him coming back for more, and as he said to me the other day, he can never say no to Patricia. So he's earned many awards and accolades over his career, with the most recent recognition of becoming a patron of the Saskatchewan Educational Leadership Unit. So it is my pleasure to ask him to introduce our keynote, Dr. Dianne Looker. Murray, off to you.
Thank you very much, Don. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Looker. So we're having a lot of pleasure here. I just like to remind people to put Dr. Looker's presentation into context, that the theme of this year's Congress is Rural Education Beyond Borders, Reframing the Conversation. So it's a reflective component. And we had an excellent start with the meta-analysis description of rural education in Norway, China, and the USA this morning. And it was appropriate that our penultimate session, we step back and have a meta look at rural public schooling in Canada. And we're fortunate to have Dr. Dianne Looker speak on the topic, rural urban, what's the difference for schooling in Canada, looking at the larger picture to get that Canadian reflective component. Dr. Looker is an Emerita professor of sociology at Mount St. Vincent and Acadia Universities in Nova Scotia. She's a Level 1 Canada Research Chair in Equity and Technology, examining issues of gender, ethnicity, rural, urban, and socio-economic status impact, how they impact the facility with and access in technology. Previous to accepting her chair, Dr. Looker was a full professor at Acadia University in the Department of Sociology, where she has also served as chair of the department from 1995 to 2002. Over her career, much of her research has examined rural youth and their transition to adulthood, taking a life course perspective on the paths they pursue. Her current research looks at alternative and atypical paths to adulthood, including those chosen by youth who opt to stay in and return to or move to rural areas. Much of this research deals with various forms of mobility in and out of the home to and from one's community of origin and to and from rural areas. Most recently, she was working on looking at factors influencing youth and youth adults to stay in a locale, challenging the notion that mobility is the only or the best path for them. Dianne has published and presented extensively on these topics and has been awarded several major research grants and contracts dealing with equity issues, including issues of rurality and mobility stability. She served as an advisor for a number of organizations, including Industry Canada, Human Resources and Skills Development Canada, Statistics Canada, and Maritime Provincial Higher Education Commission, and the Council of Ministers of Education Canada and the Canadian Millennium Scholarship. So she has a background that gives her a broad and deep perspective of rural education in Canada. And she just told us before we started here that her hobby is woodworking. So I'm expecting a carefully crafted and well-turned presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Dr. Looker.
Thank you very much. And thank all of you for hanging in there today and coming to hear what I have to say. This is I'm an empirical researcher, and so it's a fairly empirical presentation. I want to put some of the excellent comments and research that we've heard over the course of the day in the larger Canadian context and also position it with respect to Saskatchewan, looking primarily at Statistics Canada data. Before I go any further, I want to say that I'm speaking to you from Nova Scotia, Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. And I think it's important to note that. So I'm going to start my presentation now. This is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to look at what is rural, the importance of clarity of those definitions, which has come up several times over the last day and a half, some issues from the research literature, particularly the decline in the school-age population in rural areas, the fact that schools in rural areas are often smaller, and the difficulty, we've heard this many times over the last day, difficulty attracting and keeping teachers in rural schools. I'm also going to look at school dropout rates and how that's intertwined inevitably, especially in Canada and elsewhere, with Aboriginal identity. And I'm hoping I'll have some time to talk about rural schools and COVID. So one of the things that I want to emphasize is that it's really, really important how we define rural. And again, this has come up several times. Came up in our international panel. And I'd like you to think about what you mean by rural. Do you mean not large urban centers? Do you mean small town? Do you mean remote rural? Because it matters in terms of what we're talking about. And if we're going to have evidence-based policy, we have to think about whether or not the evidence that we're reading or the evidence we're presenting is in fact relevant to the rurality that other people are looking at and thinking of. So Statistics Canada has a lot of different definitions. And one of the points I want to leave you with is that it's really important to be clear about your definition, both when you're reading and when you're communicating about rural schools. So in this presentation, I'm going to make two main distinctions. One is between metro and non-metro. And while it's more complicated than this, and the slide deck will give you more details when I make them available, it's basically a cutoff of 100,000 or more versus those that are less. And one of the reasons for using that is because the data allow us to look at that, but also that's a really important distinction in a lot of areas in Canada. Another cutoff is the one between rural and small town, which are 10,000 or less, and everything above that, which includes the large metropolitan areas, plus census agglomerations. Rural and small town is also broken down into subcategories, which are called metropolitan influenced zones, or MIZ. One of the things that I want to highlight before I go further is that the vast majority of the Canadian population, even slightly more now because this is data from 2016, 71% more are in the large metropolitan centers, 100,000 or more. Census agglomerations account for another 12%. So that leaves only 17% in this rural and small town. And those are broken down in this way. And I want to particularly point out this no metropolitan influence zone, no MIZ, and also the territories outside Yellowknife and Whitehorse. Combined, actually, they constitute 1% of the Canadian population. And that's important because in some of the graphs, they will be very, very different. They are very remote. Weak and no MIZ are very remote rural. So most of the analysis that I'm going to present involve this metro, non-metro, and although some will look at the rural and small town. So this is a map of Canada. For those of you outside Canada, this block here is replicated. This is the concentration in Southern Ontario, and here's Saskatchewan. And one of the things you'll notice, the dark red are the central metropolitan areas, the large 100,000 plus, and the yellow are the census agglomerations. So all the rest of the landmass is outside those two areas. And this is the breakdown by province. Okay, so I think the key thing is that I will be talking about the difference between metro, which is 100,000 and up, versus non-metro in most of my presentation. Some of it will be rural and small town, which are in this slide. It's the red, the green, the blue, and the black. So we see in Canada that over 70% of the population is in large metropolitan areas. It's a lot lower in Saskatchewan. So one of the things that I wanted to point out here.
Hi, sorry, I kept trying to answer your calls, but we're in a concrete steel jungle here, and
I can't hear you, Dawn. I can't hear you.
yeah, no, yeah. All right, yeah, bye.
Dawn, if you're trying to say something to me, I cannot hear you. I mean, I can hear you, but it's muffled.
Okay, my apologies. Keep going, please.
Okay. So, the main distinctions that I'll be talking about are metro versus non-metro, which, as we can see, is 71% of the Canadian population, but a lot less in Saskatchewan, and a lot of variation across the provinces. So it matters where you live. Why is it not going to the next slide? There. So, what are some of the issues in the research literature? Decline in the school-age population in rural areas, smaller schools, difficulty at keeping and attracting teachers, and that will be reflected in age, temporary positions, and teacher turnover, and also the school dropout rates. Most of the data that I'm presenting here are from special requests to Statistics Canada, and I want to acknowledge the work that's been done by my friend and colleague Ray Bowman, creating charts from this, which is no mean feast. So, has there been a decline in the school-age population? Let's look at the trends in Canada. In virtually all of these slides, the blue line with diamonds will be metro, and the red line with squares will be non-metro. And here we see that there's been a slight increase in the non-metro population, 6 to 14 years of age in recent years, and an even higher increase in the metropolitan. So while over a long period of time, there's been some decline in the school-age population, that's changing, and it's actually it's predicted to change more. This is the picture for Saskatchewan, where we see that Again, in recent years, there's a slight increase in both metro and non-metro, and particularly in metro. This is for the secondary school students, a slight decline, but that's going to change because those younger ones are going to be moving up to secondary. And this is the pattern for Saskatchewan for secondary school age children. So population trends, which is what I'm talking about here, but even though they'll be presented in many other charts, I'm going to be mostly focusing on rural urban in future. Here we see that there's actually not a lot of evidence of a decline in the school age population, i.e. a decline in the demand for teachers. Are rural schools smaller? We look at the percentage of teachers in rural as compared to urban in small schools, those with fewer than 20 employees. And here we see, given that the non-metro is higher than the metro, that a higher percentage of higher percentage of teachers in non-metro areas are in small schools. At the Canada level, less of a change, less of a difference in terms of secondary, but there is evidence that more rural teachers are teaching in small schools, at least at the elementary level. That's less true in the secondary. I have a number of measures of teacher turnover: age, percent with a temporary job, tenure with the current employer, and mobility. Next set shows the percent of younger teachers, those who are less than 35 years of age. This is Canada-wide, and we see that, in fact, fewer of the teachers are young, Canada-wide, in metro compared to non-metro. So that doesn't support the idea that there's more teacher turnover in terms of younger teachers. This is the picture in Saskatchewan. It bounces around more because the sample size is smaller, but still there's no support for the evidence that there are more young teachers in rural areas if rural means non-metro. The next set looks at age by metropolitan influence zones in the 2016 census. And remember, these two categories here count for less than 1% of the total population. But again, there's not a lot of difference here in terms of the number of young teachers, slightly higher in the more remote areas. And that's the same picture in Saskatchewan. And there we see that there are even fewer young teachers the farther you get from a metropolitan center. So there's very little evidence of a rural-urban difference in the trends over time, and any differences suggest that there are fewer young teachers, i.e. there's less turnover by that measure. What about those with a temporary job? Here we see not a lot of difference, but in recent years, slightly more non-metro than metro, Canada-wide, have a temporary job. Here's the picture in Saskatchewan where the situation is somewhat reversed. Again, there's not much difference, but non-metro are less likely to say they have a temporary job. So there's not a huge urban-rural difference in terms of the number of teachers with a temporary job. So this helps put some of your individual experiences and the experiences in your schools and school boards, hopefully in the larger context in terms of Canada-wide and the province. What about time with the current employer? If there's a lot of turnover, then people will have spent less time with their current employer. Here we see, again, not much difference. Canada-wide, not a lot of difference in terms of Saskatchewan. So if anything, the rural line was higher, so they had longer tenure. So there's not a lot of support here for these, the turnovers. What about geographic moves? In terms of the census data, percent of teachers who've lived in a different subdivision. Here we do see that those that are remote areas and those in the territories, there's been more mobility in the last year. So there's some support there for higher turnovers in the more remote areas, not so much in the more urban adjacent, which is most of the rural communities in Canada. And in Saskatchewan, not much mobility in those suburban areas, if that's what they would be called there, those in the strong metropolitan influence zone, otherwise not a lot of difference. So not a consistent pattern, but it's in Canada, those that are very remote and those in the territories seem to have somewhat higher teacher turnover, but not elsewhere in rural areas. So that just overviews the same things that we found, that there seems to be more mobility if we get farther from the urban areas. And in data that I didn't show you, younger teachers are more mobile. So here's an overview of what we found in terms of teacher turnover. If you look at the metro, non-metro comparisons, which are the top three bars here, we do not see much evidence of turnover by age, by those with the temporary contract, by those in terms of how long they've spent with the same employer. But if you shift and look at the degree of rurality in terms of whether or not they're close to a metropolitan area or farther from a metropolitan area, there is some indication of turnover in terms of younger teachers in the no-MIS areas and more mobility. So again, that comes back to it matters how you measure it, it matters how you define it. One of the other issues that's an ongoing one in the research literature, not just in Canada, but elsewhere, is the high school dropout rates. This is a fairly important chart. I'm going to bring it back again a little later. But here you see that the gradient of the further you get from metropolitan area, the higher the high school dropout rates. So I want you to remember that chart, but I'll also bring it back. I'm going to do a bit of an aside into Aboriginal identity, and it will become clear why. Aboriginal identity is very important in Canada as elsewhere for a number of reasons. One of which is that the younger the age category, the higher the percent who identify as Aboriginal. So more and more of the students, particularly in rural areas, will identify as Aboriginal. And this is particularly true in non-metro areas. So this is the percent of the population under 20 years of age by province and territory, the percent that have an Aboriginal identity. In Canada, it's down here, less than 20, but it's much, much higher in Saskatchewan, as you would know. This is the percent. If you look at the absolute numbers, Canada's not on the list because it would be way off the chart. Even though the percent's higher in Saskatchewan, the numbers in Ontario and in British Columbia are even higher still. But it's a significant part of the population, and it's becoming more significant in terms of the younger age group. And this just emphasizes the fact that in non-metro areas, the green bars, the percent with an Aboriginal identity is much, much higher than in older groups. That's much more true in the non-metro areas than in the metro areas. This is the Canada-wide chart, and this is the chart for Saskatchewan. So again, in non-metro areas, the issue of Aboriginal identity becomes that much more important, which those of you who work in those areas know. You don't need me to tell you that. So about 15% of the school-age children in non-metro areas Canada-wide identify as Aboriginal, and over 30% in Saskatchewan. So let's look at, this is the chart I showed you before. It's the identical chart. These are the dropout rates by metropolitan influence zones, how far you are from the metro area. This is the percent of the population who have dropped out of high school who are Aboriginal. And this puts it together. And this is probably the most important chart in my whole presentation. The pink bars are those with a non-Aboriginal identity. The blue bars are those who identify as Aboriginal. This is the percent without a high school diploma by the age of 2022, based on where they were living when they would have been in high school. The gradient that we saw in terms of high school dropout rates does not exist for the non-Aboriginal population. It's the Aboriginal population that's driving those numbers. And that is really important when we're trying to understand what's going on in rural areas. This is the pattern in Saskatchewan. And again, you're familiar with this, you know this. This is basically larger scale data to verify what you're experiencing in your schools and your school boards. So while it's true that school dropout rates are higher in rural areas, the pattern reflects those who have an Aboriginal identity. So it may not be rurality that is the issue here, but the absolutely complex and convoluted and problematic history of Aboriginal people in Canada. And of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had a lot to say about that. And I was encouraged to see the kinds of presentations today about the innovative ways that different schools and school boards are trying to bring more culturally relevant material to both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, so that to correct some of that. So, an overview. There's little evidence of declines in the school-age population. It is true that at least elementary schools in rural are small, but there's very little difference in terms of secondary school. There's very little evidence of more rural turnover if you compare metro to non-metro. There is somewhat more turnover in terms of age and mobility, but only in very remote rural areas. So this is coming back to some of those trends that were persistent ideas in the research literature. And we're showing that for much of Canada, for much of the rural areas of Canada, the trends that have been documented, in fact, don't apply to them, mostly apply to the remote rural areas. So if we're going to have evidence-based policy and practice, we need to be clear what the evidence is telling us. There are higher dropout rates in rural, but we need to look at how that's been implicated with the way that Aboriginal peoples have been treated in Canada and how they interact with the school system. So I hope I've left a little bit of time to talk about rural schools and COVID, because it's really hard to come today and not be aware of the fact that this has been a very, very weird year. And so I've found some literature, there's a lot of research that's ongoing, and I've tried to pull out some key issues that I think might be relevant to share with you. Here we see the employment in the education sector in Canada. And one of the things you'll notice is this is the month of the year in 2019. This is the typical pattern. If we went back several years, you'd see exactly this pattern. Go along at a certain level, and in the summer months, the contract people are laid off, then they're hired back. And normally you just see that same pattern over and over again. Here's March of 2020. First of all, it's not July. Boom, this is the number of people in education services. It also applies if you look just at teachers, but we didn't have some of the detailed data for teachers. We can generalize it to just teachers. So this is the impact on the teaching profession in terms of the decline in the number of people who worked regular hours, and the blue lines down here at the bottom, hopefully you can see it. That's the increase in the people who were theoretically employed in the education sector, who in the week prior to the survey worked 0 hours. It's come back, but people still experienced that loss. There was an interesting survey of teacher perceptions in 8 different countries that looked at how teachers compared in-person learning to what they would see the students getting in face-to-face in-class learning. And overall, teachers tend to give fairly low marks at 4.8 out of 10, where 10 is it's as good as in-person learning. Canadian and German and in Australia gave slightly higher marks to online instructions than other countries did, but still, it was recognized that it's not the same. And there's concern that there's several months of learning lost, especially in mathematics. And as we saw the discussions today in terms of how different mental health workers reached out to students, there's a recognition that there's some severe mental health and physical activity issues. And there's also recognition that vulnerable students, whether they're vulnerable because of poverty, because of disability, because of their family situation, because of their ethnicity, they are hit harder by having to shift to online learning. Another research showed access to the internet, which is obviously critical for access to online learning. And while over 95% of households with a child under 18 in Canada had some access to the internet, it was higher. The access was higher in Metro. The lack of access was somewhat higher, and that's a statistically significant difference in non-Metro. They also looked at, among those who had internet, was there at least one device per person? Because if the parents are staying home and working from home and there's multiple children in the household, you're going to need more than one device. And about 60% had less than one device per person. So there's a lot of challenges there in terms of scheduling access. And even more critically, among those households with internet with children under 18, 20% of those in non-metro had mobile devices only, which are incredibly limited in terms of both the work that can be done on them, but also the schoolwork that can be done on them. In a separate report, the CRTC shows that access to high-speed internet is much more restricted in rural. So if we're going to go to online learning, we're going to use online learning, we have to recognize that there still are issues in many rural and many remote areas. Are there any advantages to remote learning? Well, one of the things I looked at was busing. And I looked at busing because you don't have to bus to school if you're doing online. There's a lot of literature to show that rural students are more likely to use school buses. They have much longer bus rides, sometimes incredibly long bus rides. They have longer wait times before and after school time because they arrive with the bus and have to wait for the bus. And more often they are on buses that mix elementary with older students, which creates its issues. So what are the issues with long bus rides? Well, there's a lot of evidence that it has incredible impact on other activities, that students and their families might engage in, although obviously less so during COVID. Issues of bullying, coordination of schedules in the family, impact on learning, impact on physical activity, and impact on sleep. So if we're not busing, hopefully some of these negative impacts might be mitigated. And I wanted to pick up on that last one in terms of sleep, because I've recently read a really interesting book called Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker that highlights the critical importance of sleep, particularly for adolescents, but also for young children. And that early rising and sleep disruption influences how we learn, how much we learn, how much we retain, complex thinking. It also affects behavior, ADHD and things like that, and moods and depression. And so if students don't have to get up early to catch the bus, they can presumably sleep later. And he looked at certain states in the United States and also certain countries that initiated later school start times. So one of the questions that I'd like to raise is, now that we've had this circuit breaker and we've stopped doing things the old way, when we go back, is there room for modifying some of the ways we do things, including school start times? Presumably, parents are not making students get up at 6:15 to start their homework, and so they may have more sleep. And if that additional sleep leads to additional learning, then perhaps that might be a muted benefit. So, this is my last slide. Rural matters, you know that. And I want to emphasize that the definition of rural matters, that we need to be clear both in our discussion and in our policies what we mean by rural, and particularly whether or not some of the issues that we address to apply to only certain kinds of rural areas. Many of the issues that were in the research literature were mostly or sometimes only relevant in the more remote areas, and they do not apply to the majority of the rural population. So that's important. And as I've said, and others have emphasized, if you're going to be looking at rural issues, whether it's in the Sami in the north of Norway or the Indigenous people in Canada, we have to recognize that there's a higher concentration in rural areas, and therefore the complexity of dealing with and the importance of dealing with Aboriginal issues comes to the fore. And COVID-19 has created a lot of challenges for us, but I think it's also presented some opportunities for rural schooling, and I was pleased to hear discussions of those opportunities as I listened earlier. So thank you for listening to me. Some of the material that I presented is in the excellent book by Michael Corbett and Dianne Looker, although I've updated some of those charts and added some additional ones. So thank you very much. I very much look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, thank you, Dianne. Wow, that gives us so much to chew on for the end. So
yes, I hope I didn't overwhelm people with too many charts, but
no, it was fascinating. And one of the questions that I had when I was watching you present, and I'm not sure that our international audience would understand the census data and self-report of Aboriginal identity. So one of my questions would be, given that it's self-report of Indigenous identity, do you presume that those numbers probably are higher for the Indigenous population because there may be a lot of Indigenous students who haven't self-identified in that group?
actually there's an interesting analysis that looks at Aboriginal identity mobility from one census to the next. And one of the things that it appears is that when you're looking at young people, it would be their pick, because this is from census data. The parents might report them as being Aboriginal. And then when they're out on their own, there's a slight dip. And they may decide not to. But in fact, there's been an increase in the percent of the population that have identified as Aboriginal each time the measures are taken, much more than could be accounted for by the increase in age. So more and more people are recognizing and honoring and sharing their Aboriginal identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks. So we're starting to get some questions from some of our participants here. And I've got a friend of mine named Patricia Prowse, who was the person who told me never waste a crisis to get a good opportunity. So as you're speaking about COVID impacts, one of the questions that's come forward here, other than the ones that you've mentioned briefly, can you see some additional opportunities post-COVID for rural or even some of the remote rural regions that you've been looking at?
Well, I think there are others that are much better positioned than I am to answer that question, because I heard some really innovative ideas today in terms of community hubs, sharing resource teachers, for example, or specialization teaching. Because one of the things, even though there may rural schools may be able to attract teachers, they may not be able to offer all the variety of specializations, and particularly at the secondary school level. So some of the sharing and the hybrid communication that the COVID has made us use. I mean, the schools have access to technology. And one of the things that, again, over the course of the last day, I was hearing that one of the things that the funding that was provided meant that the technology in the schools has been upgraded, the support, the platforms. I mean, there are kinds of possibilities for teachers in terms of sharing, for students in terms of sharing, for supports and professional development. So I think that technological advance is certainly a great potential that COVID has given us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the things that Dr. Pratt had alluded to in the panel this morning was the notion that schools are becoming better equipped and a little bit better funded in relation, but that's not necessarily dealing with some of the issues in families, right? And you alluded to that in your presentation around the devices. I'm actually, and my own personal experience, I'm 5 miles out of the city here in Saskatoon, and my family in rural Saskatchewan probably has better access right now than I do to the internet, because I'm sharing a tower with everybody outside of Saskatoon. So I'm wondering when our infrastructure will actually catch up, and then the financial cost of that for local families.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see. Yeah. I think I overwhelmed people.
Oh, this is partly the lag time in the questions coming in, I believe. Yeah. Okay.
One of the things that on my last slide, and I will share the full deck, I had some slides that were hidden in the presentation, and also you didn't get to see some of the first ones. But there is a link to provincial level data that we've done, very, very detailed, more information, if you can believe it, than I presented here today. And so I would encourage people to go and look at that because it is a real source of information that you won't find anywhere else, because they were special requests that were put together to Stats Canada.
Well, thanks for doing that for us. I'm wondering, you've done quite a lot of work too on equity in place. Where do you see some of the equity concerns popping up, especially now post-COVID?
Well, I haven't done the research post-COVID. The equity issues that I was looking at were equity in access to technology, actually, in Nova Scotia and in Nunavut. And at the time, there was such limited access in Nunavut, it was astounding. But one of the things that was striking was that in many areas of Nova Scotia, there were still, and still are, pockets where you can't access high-speed internet. And so that creates incredible issues, and those issues would be compounded during COVID when so much was online, not just schooling, but also when people were trying to work from home. So people would have to drive to a nearby town to upload documents in a parking lot.
Mhm.
So that's real. That's happening in 2021.
Mhm. Mhm. We've got another question that just came in here for you. Are there other myths that you've learned about rural education that statistics do not support?
Well, I wouldn't call any of those myths. I think it's more that coming back to the point that I was emphasizing, that it matters what you mean by rural. And if you simply mean less than 100,000, then there's not a lot of those differences. So it's more a matter of identifying what are the things that are due to being rural, what are the things that are due to being remote, what are the things that are due to the ethnic or Aboriginal mix in your community. So the history of your community, the cultures of your community. I think it's important to recognize that while many rural communities share a lot of experiences, there's also some really important differences. And that rural in northern Saskatchewan is not the same as rural in southern Saskatchewan. Rural in Saskatchewan is not the same as rural in Nova Scotia. I mean, you can't get very far from the city, even if you try in Nova Scotia. And the same in Prince Edward Island. But there are areas that experience rurality in other ways, in terms of access to healthcare, for example, in terms of access to various facilities and services. So, so I basically gave you the key ones that I thought were important in terms of, but I must admit, I was surprised that when I started looking at the data, I didn't expect that there would be the consistency between rural and urban that I found in so many of the measures. Because if you read the research literature, it's based often on people's experiences, and that's real for that. That is true. It's not a myth. It is real for them. It's just, this gives you an idea of how to put it in the larger picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So another one of our participants has asked a question, and now you get to be a governmental agency for the day. And if you could prioritize the areas that governments should champion in order to sustain rural schools, what would they be?
Oh, now that's a tough one. I mean, I think the fate of rural schools and the fate of rural communities are intricately linked. So if you want the schools to survive, the community's got to survive. And if you want the community to survive, the schools got to survive. So I think to some extent, rural economic development would be an important thing. One of the things in terms of rural economic development, though, I mentioned Ray Bowman. He put together, he's the one that created the physical charts for this. He did a presentation a while back that showed that in every census, rural communities grew. And then they got reclassified because now they're urban.
Mm.
Okay. because rurality is based on size. So successful rural communities are no longer considered rural by Stats Canada. Now, they may not know that they've gone past that magic cutoff of 10,000 or 100,000, right? So successful rural economic development may mean that you're now classified differently in the analysis, but your experience is you are doing really well as a small town in Saskatchewan, in Nova Scotia, and you've grown and you've got strong schools and everything's good, but you're now counted as urban. But to come back, I think economic development is key. And in terms of specifically in terms of education, I think some of the policies that I heard today, the training and the supports and the links of teachers, having urban teachers go out to rural areas and see what it's like and how wonderful it is to live here. And so that it's not just rural students leaving to go to urban areas, but also urban students wanting to come to rural areas. And so if it was an education minister, I'd say supports for the teachers, and the local communities and local teachers will tell you what kind of supports they need.
Yeah. And I think that the final question here is probably more around the nature of the data that you're presenting again. Are the data that you presented here today, does that include First Nations communities, like federally funded reserve schools, or this is public school system data?
The census data and the labor force survey would include everybody.
Okay.
And who's excluded and who's included in any particular graph, you got to read the footnotes. There are some exclusions in some.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. I'm not seeing any other additional questions right now, but I would imagine there's going to be many more that come. And if there are, we'll collate them for you.
That sounds wonderful. And you can send them on to me. And as I say, I will make the presentation available, and then people can look at it and absorb it a bit more, because it was a lot of information to try to absorb in a very short time. But definitions matter. There's not as much rural urban difference that you like. Remote is different, and you've got to look at Aboriginal.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate what you've done today to help us finish off, because it not only leaves our participants with a Canadian experience, and thank you for the Saskatchewan experience, but it also is about reframing a conversation, right? Even regardless of what may or may not be in the rural literature, it just reminds us continually we have to go back and reframe what we mean by what is rural education and what we're continuing to promote as tropes. We need to be leery of whether that's actually supported. So
yeah.
Thanks so much, Dianne. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, I guess that means that this is our time to bid most of you farewell. The time has flown. I can't tell you how quickly this day and a half went, but I hope that the last couple days has given all of you an opportunity to explore some diverse conversations that literally has gone beyond borders and help us all sort of reframe our understandings of what we mean when we talk about rural or remote education. We often hear use rural, remote, and northern. Well, we've been happily have colleagues and friends from the southern hemisphere. So we've been using rural and remote rather than rural, remote, northern, southern, eastern, and western. So just thanks to all of you. I want to send a heartfelt thank you to everyone involved in this year's Congress, starting with Elder Spidell, who was here to help us off in a good way, the dignitaries that gave greetings, our keynotes, Dianne, our Honorable Bev Busan, Dr. Beck, Dr. Lu Jing, Dr. Pratt, who are here, all of you who have presented, and I mean, particularly those of you that are coming from near and far, primarily far in terms of time zones even, participants who've given of your time to come. The moderators, I hope you enjoyed our teacher candidates as much as they're telling us already they enjoyed the presentations. We had our 2 performers last night, Kate and Kurt. We have to shout out there. The sponsors, of course, and members of our planning and organizing committees. In particular, we cannot go far enough away to acknowledge the efforts of the local planning team we had. And that is, again, you never saw all of their faces. We have to do better next year. Patricia, Holly, Idowu, Kevin, Rob, and Megan. As I said yesterday, a small but mighty team. But given the fact that we've taken on a major winter blizzard right now and still managed to get the event off and running, I think we're doing well. So the final housekeeping note, I just want to remind all of you, we really hope you will take 5 minutes to do our feedback questionnaire. It is our first time that we have done this virtually. And so it's been in the same document where you found all the links to your learning sessions. I really would ask that you help us ensure that our event remains strong. I felt so bad last year to have to cancel our silver anniversary and be the person who did that. But we want to make sure this event is relevant and appreciates the very unique needs of rural spaces, people, and all the communities you all support. So please take the time to do that feedback questionnaire and really see you all next year and be well.